I don't think I could have written this video without the help of coffee. The performance-enhancing drug of anyone trying to get stuff done, blue-collar workers and college students on deadlines, and we are not alone. Ever since coffee first exploded onto the global scene, it has been fueling scientific breakthroughs, inspiring art and poetry, and keeping us going through good times and bad. But coffee is never mentioned in ancient history. So where did it actually come from, and how did it end up everywhere? Today we are following the story of coffee from the very beginning, tracing its path through history and covering the fascinating characters who led the way, played a role in its development, or tried anything to stop its meteoric rise. Whatever you think you know about the history of coffee, the real story is 1,000 times wilder. So we're loading up on caffeine and diving in. Today on OTR. In the year 1735, the city of Leipzig in today's Germany was in a full-blown panic over the popularity of a new drink known as coffee. Now, this was entirely generational. Like the same way our parents might have reacted to our taste in music, older Germans thought this trendy new beverage was the height of depravity and a sign that things were going downhill fast in polite society. The local newspaper, the first daily newspaper in the entire world, referred to the young generation as coffee-drinking apes. Doctors said that coffee could lead to psychological disorders, and since people who drank the stuff used to socialize and talk about complicated subjects, well, obviously that was a danger to society's women, who were quickly banned from Leipzig's cafes, a ban that would be largely ignored. The biggest of the cafes was known as Zimmermann's, said to be as lively and energetic as any bar today, especially on Friday evenings, when the city's musical director, Johann Sebastian Bach, would assemble a group of musicians and put on a free concert. Bach's performances at Zimmermann's were less stoic concertos than rambunctious parties, and his most popular piece, written for the Friday occasions, was known as Be Still, Stop Talking, or more commonly, the Coffee Cantata. It was basically a 25-minute-long mini-opera telling the story of a young woman fighting with her conservative father about her love for coffee. He tries everything to get her to stop, taking away her possessions, her food, favorite clothing, but she will not budge. Finally, he tells her that if she won't give up coffee, he'll ban her from getting married. So she agrees and finds a nice husband. But in secret, she adds a clause to the marriage contract that he must provide her with all the coffee she could possibly desire. The performance ends with the three main characters all joining hands to sing a song about how drinking coffee is just the best. And no matter how much the old generation didn't like it, pretty soon everyone else would agree. By today, it's impossible to imagine a world without coffee. We consume more than 2.3 billion cups per day, from one side of the planet to the other. Coffee is essential to life here in Thailand, in South America and Northern Europe, where in Finland it's a requirement for workers to be given 2 coffee breaks every single day. A trip to Italy means mainlining espresso, and no visit to Hanoi would be complete without egg coffee or the famous coconut coffee smoothie. There is yuan yang in Hong Kong diners, Turkish coffee essential in Istanbul, and Café Cubano, iconic of course in Cuba. Coffee can be served from the pot in the United States or made into an art form in Melbourne, Australia. We make our coffee at home before heading out, bring our laptops to work in a cafe, and of course, when we meet our friends, we go out for coffee, as you saw on the TV show Friends, and a countless number of other television programs or movies where coffee is the centerpiece of everyday life, or at least something without which getting through the day would be unthinkable. But given that as recently as the 18th century coffee, at least in Leipzig, was a brand new arrival, how did all of this happen? Now, full disclosure, if you watch every single OTR video, we have covered this next part before, at least in a quick 2-minute segment. Honestly, everyone on YouTube does the history of coffee. It is maybe the most common topic I have ever encountered while working on one of these history of stories, which is crazy because we've gotten into staples like rice and bread. The origin of coffee is by now very well known, at least a legend about a farmer named Kaldi in Ethiopia, who one day watched as his goats ate a bunch of berries. The goats started jumping around and acting crazy, so Kaldi took the berries to a local temple to be examined by monks. The holy men took a look and said it was the work of the devil, so they threw the berries into a fire where they started to roast and smell incredible. The monks scooped out the berries, put them in a bowl, and covered them in water to cool them down, and thus was born coffee, and that is pretty much the story that's everywhere on the internet. But it was made up a few hundred years later as part of a marketing campaign to sell Italian coffee. So what is the real story? Let's start at the beginning. Around 700 years ago, a group of elders from Ethiopia's Oromo tribe met in what's now Madawalabu to codify a set of laws and agree on the policies to govern a large and growing East African territory. These elders were not chieftains or members of royal families. They were elected. The Oromo, one of the world's first true democracies, at least since the fall of the Roman Republic. Their society was advanced. Over thousands of years, they developed their own language, culture, and religion, known as Wakafana. In ancient Wakafana mythology, the world was created by a god named Waka, a benevolent deity who cared for his people. And when the first man died, Waka buried him in the ground and wept. And from his tears came a plant that would be the most sacred, the most essential to the Oromo people, what we now call coffee. Every Oromo ceremony or political gathering involved prayers or blessings over bowls of coffee berries. No contracts could be formalized or conflicts resolved without some sharing of coffee, and weddings would begin with a new bride biting open coffee berries, which would then be cooked in clarified butter and given out to all the guests. But the main use of coffee was not ceremonial, it was functional. Whenever Oromo hunters would head out to find prey, when warriors would leave for battle, or even when farmers would start a day in the fields, they would grind ripe coffee berries in a mortar and pestle, add in some animal fat, and form the mixture into balls the size of quarters. They'd fill leather pouches with these coffee snacks, and this would provide the main sustenance for Oromo tribesmen. An early power bar packed with nutrients, fat, sugar, and of course a massive pop of caffeine. Now, the Oromo, at least for most of history, didn't actually drink coffee. But for the sake of this story, that doesn't really matter, because that meeting of the elders in 1350 would prove to be the big bang that would lead us to the present. Basically, over the next few years, Oromo traders would spread out across the region, establishing contacts and building relationships with neighboring tribes in Ethiopia and as far as South Sudan in today's Eritrea and Djibouti. On one of these trading missions, they would find their way into a tiny settlement in extreme isolation, the home of a people called the Kaficho, who lived deep in the forest and to that point had shunned all contact with outsiders. The Kaficho had their own tradition of using coffee, one that, as far as we can tell, they developed completely independently a very long time ago. It involved removing the seed or coffee bean from the fruit, then roasting the beans in a pan over a flame. After that, they would be ground and then soaked in water in a specialized clay pot. This would then be heated again, with salt and clarified butter and herbs added into the mixture. The local people would drink this concoction constantly, serving it several times a day along with their staple food, a flatbread made from ensete, or false banana flour. The bread would be softened in this hot coffee liquid, and that was the Kaficho diet. Now, I don't know why Oromo traders were allowed to visit the Kaficho settlement. For hundreds of years before and after, the tribe would live in complete isolation, shunning all contact with outsiders. But luckily for all of us, they made at least this one exception, and it would change the world. Almost immediately, this new form of drinkable coffee would sweep across Ethiopia, becoming a sensation among the Oromo people and catching on wherever they would trade, just in time for the civilization's golden age and rapid expansion. And while that is just the beginning of this story and we have a very long way to go, I can't think of a better excuse for us to take a break for our first cup of coffee. The Ethiopian coffee ceremony is one of those things that everybody should get to experience. I was lucky enough to get to do this 1,000 times in Ethiopia. when Daria and I spent a month there a few years back. But honestly, even thousands of miles away, it's still pretty much the same idea, and the same incredible coffee. It can take a solid 2 or 3 hours for a proper coffee break in Ethiopia, and that's the idea. To relax, talk to the people around you, and just exist, while fresh coffee beans are washed, roasted over coals, crushed, and then brewed. Then you don't just drink your cup and leave, you stick around until the jibena is empty, then filled back up and emptied again. So we did this at another place in our history of breakfast video last year, and I thought about, we don't like to repeat things. We cannot do the history of coffee without Ethiopia.
Yes.
We just can't. I think, and I'm going to talk a little bit because this is really hot, and I'm going to give it a second before we actually take our first sip. Let me talk you through what we have. Coffee. Most important thing in any Ethiopian home is the jibena. Is that right? Most important thing. Every family has to have one. You pass it down to your kids. This is the coffee pot. So we were just talking off camera. When we went to Ethiopia, that's my biggest regret. We should have brought one back with us.
It would have collected all the dust at home, though.
I know, we don't. We just order on Grab. So coffee. This is going to be barley, and then this is something that we order. So barley is just going to be a snack you eat with coffee. This we ordered chichepsa, so this is going to be flatbread in clarified butter and berbere, which is the quintessential Ethiopian spice blend. This is kind of a breakfast food. You'll have this with coffee, but in Ethiopia, you took a sip. Is it good?
Oh, it's delicious.
Not I always forget how many countries are in Africa because it changes depending on, South Sudan is a relatively newly recognized country, Western Sahara, but it's 55 or 56, I think. Somewhere in 55, 56. All of them except for one was a colony of a foreign country, European country. The only one country that was not colonized was Ethiopia. So it really is like going back in time. It is so unlike anywhere else I have ever been. The whole country smells like this. So burning, again, it's like biblical. It's frankincense and myrrh is what they burn to, I believe, to send a signal to guests or visitors or whoever's driving by. Hey, we got coffee, come on in. It's a welcoming thing. It's, and it's that combined with the smell of the coffee beans roasting. It's like it's a welcome thing.
So that's how our driver knew that we can stop there, because they had the thing smoking outside.
I think they were just businesses. I think he knew they could stop there because it was a coffee shop. From a scientific perspective, the evolution of caffeine is fascinating. It is a genetic anomaly, an adaptation that is incredibly complex and yet is so ingenious. Over the last 70 million years, it's shown up completely independently all across the planet, from cacao in Peru and Colombia, to the tea plant in the Himalayan foothills, guarana in Brazil, the kola nut in West Africa, and of course, coffee in today's Ethiopia. Now, I'll make this fast, but basically caffeine is an alkaloid compound, technically C8H10N4O2. It protects a plant from predators like insects by causing a bitter flavor and even acting as a toxin if consumed in high enough doses. When coffee leaves and berries fall onto the forest floor, they release caffeine, which poisons the topsoil, preventing any other plants from taking root, so all the nearby water, nutrients, and sunlight belong only to them. And maybe the craziest effect is that in the nectar of coffee flowers, there is exactly enough caffeine to get honeybees addicted, but not enough to cause them any harm. This means that in an entire biosphere, bees that have tasted coffee will choose that plant to pollinate and ignore everything else, literally becoming hooked on caffeine. As far as we are concerned, the way it works is that basically during the day as we use energy, our brain releases adenosine, which builds up and makes us feel tired. We are calibrated to fill up our reserves of adenosine, then get drowsy and fall asleep. But caffeine blocks our adenosine receptors. It literally prevents us from receiving the signal that we are exhausted. Obviously, this does wear off. All the adenosine hits us at once and we crash hard, unless we just keep drinking coffee. Here's why I bring all of this up. In the 14th century, the country of Yemen had become the global center of a religious movement known as Sufi, or Sufism, essentially a deeply spiritual form of Islam in which followers become closer to God through chanting, music, and most of all, dancing. Hours upon hours of constant motion, most famously represented by the Whirling Dervishes of the Mevlevi order. The longer one can maintain repetitive and exhausting physical activity, the higher the ascension into the spiritual plane, and the dancing and devotionals can go on all night. Now, all of that might seem tangential until we take a look at a map and see how close Yemen actually is to the country of Ethiopia. And after coffee began to spread through East Africa, it wasn't long before it crossed the Red Sea, and Sufi followers discovered the same thing most of us have at some point in our lives. When you need to stay up late dancing, coffee helps. And this brings us to the next part of our story. Around the end of the 14th century, coffee arrived in Yemen, and we know it must have caused a sensation because all at once we see an explosion of writing from the port of Aden, describing a magical drink fueling Sufi prayers. At first this was referred to as Buna, the name in Ethiopian, but soon enough it would be given a new name, from Old Arabic, translating to the wine of life. This would be pronounced kawa. Beyond giving coffee its name, the Yemenites also domesticated the plant, cultivating massive gardens of coffee trees, and yes, in nature, it is a tree, growing in Ethiopia up to 12 meters tall. But in Yemen, farmers began the practice of trimming the branches to keep it small enough to harvest by hand even at maturity. With easy access from across the Red Sea and a new homegrown supply, Yemen had plenty of coffee, so it began to travel. And the first place it would be taken was the holy city of Mecca, brought along by Sufi Muslims on the Hajj, or pilgrimage. And here we also know it caused a sensation because we also see an explosion in writing, with a poem found in Mecca dating back to the 15th century saying, and I quote, "Coffee is our gold. Wherever it is served, one enjoys the society of the noblest and most generous men." End quote. It was also in Mecca where coffee would be first sold to the public, the very first cafes or coffee shops opening to service pilgrims from Yemen, then from everywhere. And since pilgrims arrived in the city from all across the Muslim world, coffee spread fast. So fast that within 10 years of the first record of coffee anywhere outside Ethiopia, it was the drink of choice across Egypt, the Arabian Peninsula, the Middle East, and Ottoman Turkey. And all of that coffee had to come from somewhere. It seems to have occurred to the Yemeni people pretty much from the beginning that coffee had commercial potential, and those farms we mentioned were not just planted for domestic consumption. By the time we see that first cafe in Mecca, Yemen already had laws on the books forbidding the export of raw seeds or live coffee plants. Only coffee beans that had already been sterilized were allowed to be taken abroad, and the punishment for violating this policy was death, a sentence apparently carried out more than once. To make absolutely certain no plantable coffee beans slipped through, all international trade in the country was routed through only one port, where every single boat could be and was thoroughly searched. This was the port of Al-Mocha, which is why all across the Muslim world coffee took on the nickname Mocha, or Mocha. Anyway, Yemen might have had a coffee monopoly and Mecca might have been the place where it caught on with the masses, but before long the capital of coffee culture was about to emerge in another city, a place called Istanbul. According to legend, the first Istanbul coffee shop opened as far back as 1475, the iconic Kiva Han. The truth is, it was probably built at least a little while later, but who cares? It would be part of a movement that would change the world and set us on a course leading all the way to the present. Basically, in the past, coffee was a drink. That's it, something you consume. But in Istanbul, it would become a way of life. By the time we find accounts of Turkish cafes, we read of enormous spaces, bright and open, buzzing with people and energy. The air was rich with the smell of roasting coffee and loud, echoing with crowds laughing, gossiping, talking politics, or playing games like chess or backgammon. Sometimes there would be a band or a musician on stage or a poet doing a reading. And there were no private tables. Everyone shared a floor together regardless of rank or status. It turned out coffee didn't just give energy for fighting or dancing. It was equally effective at sparking conversation. And before long, Istanbul's cafes became known as street universities or schools of the wise. And the entire culture of the empire would shift dramatically. In these cafes, artists would debut new works and find inspiration. New forms of theater and literature would develop, and the brightest minds and academics could meet and share ideas freely outside of the structured order of government and university. It was not a coincidence that the rise in Istanbul's cafes aligned exactly with the Ottoman Golden Age in the years of Suleiman the Magnificent. And it was also not a coincidence that in 1538 Suleiman would invade and conquer Yemen and seize control of Al-Moha. And for the next 100 years, it would be the Turks, not the Yemenis, profiting from the coffee monopoly. Anyway, let's go back to those cafes. At some point late in the 16th century, it started dawning on Ottoman rulers, especially those who were not magnificent, that centers of free speech might be dangerous, and we start to see crackdowns and even a few short-lived bans. But none of it would actually stick until 1633 when Sultan Murad IV, terribly unpopular and terrified of being overthrown, declared with no warning that visiting a cafe was now a capital offense. There would be no public meetings, no unauthorized gatherings, and absolutely no coffee whatsoever. But that is not the crazy part. Now, the crazy part is that Murad IV was so paranoid that he used to get incredibly drunk, dress up as a beggar, walk through the streets of Istanbul, and personally hunt for anyone violating the new law. Whenever he would catch the smell of coffee or see any person having a sip, he would rip off his shawl, announce his true identity, and then cut off their head with his own sword. Thankfully, the Sultan would die at the age of 27 from cirrhosis, all those drunken nights catching up to him quickly, and Istanbul's cafe scene would recover. Let's take a break for some Turkish coffee. There are few things on earth like a cafe in Istanbul. But we are not in Istanbul, we're in Bangkok, so we'll make do by visiting the house of a Turkish family, recently converted into a home-style restaurant. The most common legend about Turkish coffee is that its method was developed in Suleiman's royal palace. In the past, Turkish coffee had been prepared just like in Yemen, which itself was adapted almost entirely from Ethiopia. But Suleiman was so fascinated by this new drink he appointed a coffee master, assisted by a team of 40 roasters, grinders, and brewers. And that led to this. The idea of Turkish coffee is to grind the beans into a fine powder, much finer than modern coffee grounds, then to heat it with water and stir to create a rich and thick froth without burning the beans. And while today technology has advanced, the basic concept is the same, and every cup tells a story of history, the taste and superstitions we might have found in Istanbul 500 years ago.
Sorry, first here, after here.
Okay.
Now you reach the left.
Oh,
I think, what is it?
that looks like the Taj Mahal.
You need to choose your family, your business for S, and after you look here. Because you here is answer.
Business.
It's for family, business,
Business.
or
Business.
street, life,
Okay. It's a fish again.
fish. Fish
You're
is
just seeing fish.
always good. Fish is always
For
good.
fish is always good.
Yeah.
Yes, it's abundant.
Fish is abundance, yes.
Is it a fish? It's like a
I mean,
corn?
Looks like a bat hanging upside down.
a bat hanging. Well, you're also looking from the other angle. It would be- it's right side up to us. Oh, that's a bat.
In Rorschach tests, I would fail. It's just bleeps for me. A dog. Dog? Look. Nose. Ears. Like
Have you ever seen a dog
Goofy.
before?
Goofy the dog. A woman? You see a woman? Adam! Business. You see anything else?
I think that's a cut. In the heyday of Istanbul's cafe scene, with the Turkish economy booming, Suleiman the Magnificent went on the warpath, capturing Yemen and a whole lot more. As early as 1521, he would establish a foothold in Europe, taking Belgrade of today's Serbia, where immediately a coffee shop would open, the first ever on European soil, and this would repeat itself over and over as the Ottomans pushed west. The Turkish style of coffee, thick, unfiltered, the stuff we just had at the last restaurant. Well, wherever you find something that looks like that, you're probably in the old Ottoman territory. Turkish coffee would become the style consumed to this day in the Balkans, Ukraine, and Greece, all thanks to the conquests of Suleiman. And the Ottoman expansion is also how the word became standardized everywhere, Yemeni kahwa becoming Turkish kahve, which would become the root of coffee and cafe. Anyway, speaking of cafes, the Turks might have introduced the idea of coffee shops as places for gathering, but there were still a few major elements missing from what we know today. And that brings us past the Ottoman borders and into Western Europe. Coffee might have arrived on European soil in the 1520s, but given the intense distrust between the Christian West and the Ottoman Turks, this would go unnoticed on the rest of the continent for a very long time. The first actual record of coffee in Western writing comes in 1582, when a German doctor tried it on a visit to Aleppo, describing it as a black beverage good for digestion. 9 years later, coffee would be introduced to Venetian traders who bought a few bags from Istanbul and pitched it as a medicine. But this would be a hard sell after all. Word began to spread that this was a Muslim delicacy, and that was problematic. Cardinals in the Vatican lobbied the Pope, Clement VIII, to ban coffee outright, to make it illegal for Christian consumers. But the Pope decided he should try it before making any judgments, and in 1600, he famously had a taste, liked it, and gave coffee the papal seal of approval. Just like Caldi and the goats, this is a famous story, and it is true, but it didn't actually matter because the bigger problem wasn't God, it was money. The Ottomans still held a monopoly from Almohad, and their prices were so high that coffee was out of reach to all but the wealthiest foreign customers. It would take another 4 decades after the Pope's blessing for the first cafe to open in Western Europe, and that was only after the Ottomans were kicked out of Yemen in a 1638 uprising. Finally in control of their own country, the Yemeni people and the new Qasimid dynasty set out to build a new economy based on selling lots and lots of coffee, and reopen trade links with the West. The first cafe in Christian Europe would open in Venice in 1645, and before long, the floodgates would open. Coffee shops in Italy followed by more in England, Germany, France, the Netherlands, and beyond, and the impact on life in Europe would be monumental. In Austria, the Viennese introduced the idea of filtering coffee and serving it with sides like cream and sugar. The Austrians also pioneered the sale of coffee shop pastries, debuting the Kipferl in the 1680s, which would eventually become the croissant. Soon enough, bakers everywhere were adding their own specialties to local cafes. Brioche with nuts and raisins first made in Germany and sold as coffee cake. And the cinnamon bun debuted in the coffee shops of Stockholm, Sweden. Cafes would become the center of social life in France, cradles of music in what's now Germany and the Netherlands, but most of all, when we are talking about 17th century coffee shops, this is a story about London. It is very difficult to express how significant the cafe became to everyday life in England. As just a few examples, there was one coffee shop owned by a guy named Edward Lloyd, where boat captains and merchants used to meet up and talk about the conditions at sea. This would evolve into Lloyd's of London, the legendary insurance marketplace. And speaking of markets, John Castang used to post up at Jonathan's coffee shop, where he would update patrons on the day's commodities pricing, eventually growing into the London Stock Exchange. By the way, Jonathan's coffee shop would also gain notoriety as the hangout for Voltaire after his expulsion from France. In that cafe, he became friends with the niece of Isaac Newton, who told him a story about her uncle and an apple tree. Voltaire scribbled this on a napkin, and he would publish the tale to great fanfare. As for Isaac Newton himself, well, his hangout was a different London cafe, the Grecian, where he would famously stay up long hours drinking coffee with Edmund Halley and other academic titans, together formulating theories that would change our knowledge of math and science. We are by no means done. In the early 1700s, customers in London cafes began bringing in items for sale, paintings, rare books, and imported pottery. A system would begin where someone would light a small candle and customers would make offers for whatever was for sale. When the candle burned out, the highest offer won. Not only would this create the modern auction, but the world's most famous auction houses, Sotheby's and Christie's, both began inside London coffee shops. And so did prominent magazines and newspapers, The Spectator and The Tatler as two examples, both not just created for cafe customers, but actually, at least in the beginning, written in coffee shops. Cafes in London served as post offices. When ships were about to sail overseas, captains would hang a bag on the wall of their favorite cafe with the name of the destination, and anyone could drop off a letter or package for shipping for a small fee. And speaking of small fees, it was in these establishments where baristas first placed cups on the counter, labeled TIPS, at least according to legend, to ensure prompt service. The first tip jars. Anyway, with so much of English and European culture moving out of traditional spaces and into cafes, it wouldn't take long before the pushback would begin. And that brings us to the next part of this story. In spite of all the advancements in coffee culture, the 1660s were not a great time to be in London. A massive bubonic plague epidemic swept through town in 1664 and 65, and as soon as that was under control, the Great Fire of London pretty much leveled everything inside the city walls. Now, none of this was the fault of the king, Charles II, but since it happened on his watch, he began to worry about public perception. To placate the people, he introduced radical reforms granting religious freedom. A nice idea, but instead of calming things down, it would set off a furor where radicals in each group started blaming the king for supporting their enemies, and King Charles would descend into full-on paranoia. Terrified that everybody was plotting against him, in 1675 the king would issue an order to shut down all of England's cafes, to put an end to socializing. This did not go over well. So intense would be the backlash that just 11 days later he would back down and rescind the order, then live out his days in terror of enemies all around. King Charles II and Murad IV in Turkey were not completely off in assuming coffee shops were centers of anti-government radicalism. They were, and not just because of all the people coming together to socialize. That had been happening since the beginning of time. But in the past, the drink of choice was beer, and beer kept the masses drunk, unfocused, and unthreatening, at least to those in power. But coffee had the opposite effect, and all of a sudden, people were thinking. And to an unelected leader, thinking is dangerous. As coffee spread across the old world, there would be countless attempts at crackdowns and regulations, negative PR campaigns, and full-on bans. See our story from the open about Johann Sebastian Bach. And while we need to move on, here are two more insane examples. The first takes us to Prussia, where Frederick the Great was not a fan of coffee, and especially began to worry that it was infiltrating the peasant class, who he relied on to blindly support all of his foreign wars. So not only did he outlaw imported coffee, but he went as far as to hire 400 combat veterans to patrol the streets of Prussian cities, literally smelling the air to try to detect the scent of illicit coffee being roasted. These men would be known as Prussia's Kaffeeschnüffler, or coffee sniffers. And that is still less ridiculous than the next story, which comes from Sweden. In this case, the anti-coffee monarch was King Gustav III, who really wanted to ban coffee but worried about the public reaction. So he set out to prove that coffee was toxic, so no one could argue when he outlawed cafes. As an experiment, he found a pair of identical twins who had committed a murder and were both sentenced to death. The king offered to commute their sentences to life in prison with the caveat that for the rest of their lives, one must drink 3 pots of coffee a day, and the other could only drink tea. The idea was to prove that tea was safe and coffee was not. This would fail. Both brothers would outlive the king. They would survive beyond any of the doctors who observed their condition, and to this day, Sweden is among the world's leading coffee-drinking countries. Anyway, I can't absolutely say for sure that this happened. It feels like it's a legend. But honestly, who even cares, because the moral of the story is an absolute fact. Once coffee arrived anywhere, it was there to stay. So let's take a break for coffee and a croissant. The modern coffee shop, with its shelf of pastries, selection of coffee drinks, and lively atmosphere, takes bits and pieces from much of the world: Mecca, Istanbul, Stockholm, and London. But one could say the real point of origin when it all turned into this goes back to 1837, when a Viennese businessman named August Zang moved to Paris and opened a bakery. He'd introduced to France the Austrian technique of steam baking, basically injecting steam into the hot oven to keep dough soft and fluffy while the crust hardens, allowing the innovation of the baguette, the croissant, and the entire category of French pastry. It wasn't long before these would spread to Parisian cafes, along with the Austrian style of adding dense whipped cream to strong coffee, what the French would call café viennois. Then soon enough, more coffee and dairy combinations would emerge intended to pair with pastries, and the whole world's morning culture would change. So I'm an iced Americano drinker, and I understand that purists would say that that's the incorrect way to drink coffee, but we live in Thailand, we're in the tropics. I don't know how you can drink hot coffee.
I'm a purist. There is no other ways to drink coffee than black.
And I'm not arguing with you. That is probably, mine gets watered down, yours doesn't. I understand you're probably drinking more, pure tasting coffee than I am. But we're taping this in Bangkok, don't judge me. It is really, really, really hot. And
I don't know what happened to me to drink cold coffee. I don't think I have had a sip of I bought a cold coffee in years.
Yeah, no. This is ice Americano, hot Americano. Pastry, meringue.
Meringue, because I'm watching my figure for my boyfriend.
And who's he? And
there was a reference from a TV show. Okay, Jan. No? Okay, I'm gonna show it to you. I'm watching my George Glass, my boyfriend.
I'm so lost right now. I have no idea.
Tropicana. I'll show it to you. Okay.
Are you okay? Are you having a stroke? I feel like we're in a different generation now than the you don't really socialize at coffee shops the way that they did in Friends, right?
They still do it in France.
No, in Friends, the TV show Friends.
Oh.
In the year 1616, 30 years before the first cafe would open in Venice, the Dutch sent a spy into Yemen to try to smuggle out some coffee and break the monopoly. The name of this sailor was Peter van den Brugge. And if that name sounds familiar, this is the exact same guy who would later set up the first nutmeg plantation on the Banda Islands. We literally interviewed his great-great-great-great-whatever grandson, and somehow we never realized his connection to coffee because it would be pretty much lost to history. Basically, Mr. van den Brugge would actually succeed and manage to sneak out a few raw coffee beans from Almoja. He'd bring them back to Amsterdam, but coffee doesn't grow in the Dutch climate, so nothing would happen. At first. Now, it's hard for me to express how wild this is, but somehow botanists at the Amsterdam Botanical Gardens for the next 8 decades managed to keep these coffee plants alive in a small greenhouse. And then in 1696, half a century after Peter van den Brugge had died, a few cuttings of these plants were brought along on a boat sailing halfway around the world to the Dutch colony of Java. And the coffee industry would change forever. In 1711, the first shipment of Dutch coffee grown in Indonesia would reach the European market, and this would prove so successful, so in demand, that within one single decade, 2/3 of the global coffee trade was coming from Java. And after 260 years, the Almoja monopoly was over. This would lead to a lot of consequences. For one thing, the price of coffee plummeted, which led to the profusion of more cafes and the rise of home coffee consumption. The economy of Yemen collapsed. Since the Dutch relied on slaves, their coffee was cheaper. Yemen could not compete, and the country fell into a deep depression. Within a generation, most of the old coffee farms were gone, abandoned or replaced with other crops like khat, a stimulant chewed for a quick buzz. Then there would be the fallout for the Javanese, the native people of the island. Since the Indonesian colony was governed not by Holland but by the Dutch East India Company, a for-profit enterprise, coffee became a key commodity, and that meant a lot of forced labor, exploitation, ecological disaster, and full-on massacres, the worst carried out against the Sundanese of West Java, entire villages executed for coming in below quota. Just like everything about the Dutch East Indies, the coffee trade was awful. But there was one interesting legacy that came from the harsh treatment of the local people. The Indonesian farmers were banned from drinking coffee. Every bean was money meant for export. But at some point, somebody noticed that a native animal, the Asian palm civet, fed on coffee plants and seemed to eat only the best quality berries. Then the civet would digest the fruit but not the bean, which would pass through their system and be collected, the farmers keeping them for special occasions, and creating what we now call kopi luwak, the world's most expensive coffee. Anyway, in time, the Dutch would expand their coffee production to other parts of Indonesia, to Sumatra and Borneo and Sulawesi. But on that island, they found something unexpected. Coffee. Already there. And that is another fascinating story. Now, I'm going to start by saying that this is a legend. I have no idea if it's true. There are a lot of different versions online and in old writing. But the gist of it is that sometime, probably in the 1500s, a Muslim from India named Baba Budan took a pilgrimage to Mecca. On his way home, he traveled through Yemen, heading towards the port to catch his ship. He fell in love with coffee, and since he knew it didn't exist in India, he stole exactly 7 raw coffee beans and hid them in his beard, then planted them in the hills of Karnataka, his home province, and thus would begin the Indian coffee industry. The story goes that some South Indian sailor must have brought some along on a trading voyage to Sulawesi, and that's how the plant arrived. Now again, I have no idea if this story is true, but I don't have a better explanation. And it's also worth mentioning that in the 1840s, British colonists deep in the hills of Karnataka found coffee plantations that apparently had been there for a very long time. Anyway, the Dutch dominance in the global coffee industry would be short-lived, and that was because of what might be the costliest present in global farming history. In 1714, as a token of friendship to celebrate the end of the War of Spanish Succession, the mayor of Amsterdam, a Mr. Nicholas Witsen, presented one single coffee tree as a gift to Louis XIV, the King of France. The king was over the moon. This was among the rarest items in the Western world, so he showed it off to the public and had a special greenhouse constructed just to keep it safe. 9 years later, across the Atlantic on the island of Martinique, a high-born French sailor named Gabriel de Clieu was about to head home at the end of his rotation. Somehow he heard a rumor that the Dutch were having some success planting coffee in the New World, so he came up with an idea. De Clieu hatched a plan to use a family connection at the palace to sneak into what was now Louis XV's greenhouse and cut a single seedling from the royal plant. Then if all went well, he would smuggle it back to Martinique, keep it alive on the dangerous ocean crossing, somehow grow it into a massive plantation and become a national hero. In the end, that is exactly what would happen. So incredibly well would this plant take to Martinique that within a generation, Martinique and the rest of the French New World colonies supplied more than half of all the coffee sold across the entire global market. But just like for the Dutch, this was not to last. In 1727, the Portuguese in Brazil decided they wanted a piece of the action, so they sent an envoy to French Guiana to negotiate the price for a plant. The Guyanese governor said, absolutely not, our coffee is not for sale. But this is when I should mention that the envoy, a Mr. Francisco de Melo Paleta, was very handsome, apparently legendarily handsome. And in his time in Cayenne, he made quite an impression on the governor's wife. And when he left, she presented him with a bouquet of flowers, with a few raw coffee beans hidden in the bottom. And that was how the Brazilian coffee industry would start, to this day still the biggest in the world. With the Portuguese and Dutch now in possession of coffee, the French said, "F it," and agreed to sell some to the English in Jamaica, where in 1728 they would plant what's now known as Blue Mountain. Within the next few years, coffee farming would expand to Cuba, Mexico, El Salvador, Costa Rica, pretty much all across the American tropics, and all of it, literally almost all the coffee ever farmed in the entire Western Hemisphere, descended from that one single plant smuggled from Louis XV's palace, a plant that itself descended from one single raw coffee bean stolen from Yemen by Peter van de Broeke. And that raw coffee bean belonged to a plant once taken across the Red Sea, directly from the Oromo traders of Ethiopia. I think it's time for us to take a break. It's easy to follow the spread of European colonialism and see how coffee reached a huge part of the world. The tropics of the Americas, sub-Saharan Africa, and here in Southeast Asia. Anywhere the climate was suitable by the late 19th century, coffee was probably growing, but that doesn't mean it immediately became part of the native culture. In some cases, that was by force, like how the Dutch banned the Indonesian locals from drinking coffee. So too did the British pass laws against the Kenyans, with even one unauthorized coffee tree enough for a prison sentence, never mind the fact that coffee in Kenya grows wild. Sometimes coffee wasn't, quote, illegal, it was just strictly segregated and kept far away from local people. French Indochina as a classic example, even as Vietnam's coffee farms exploded. And then there were places like Hong Kong where coffee was around. It just didn't suit the local palate until new innovations started to change the native perception. The decades between the early 20th century and the end of the colonial era were kind of a third coffee big bang. Local people from one side of the planet to the other adding their own flavors and techniques to coffee, and in the process making something once forbidden completely their own. As just one example, take the Malaysian and Singaporean Kopitiam, beginning with the Hainanese domestic workers in British colonial households, introduced to the public in the 1920s, developing over time into a brand new category. Coffee beans roasted with sugar, butter, and salt, cut with wheat or dried corn to make the mixture more affordable, then add in some condensed milk or mix half and half with tea, and you have the start of a perfect Malaysian morning. Okay, we are reaching the point in the shoot when if I don't keep drinking coffee at the same rate that we have since we started, I'm gonna crash and it's all gonna be over. So we can barely pick it up. So what are you drinking?
I have coffee, regular coffee, I think. It's coffee with milk. There is coffee or coffee something. Mine is just regular.
With the condensed milk. So yours is the Malaysian proper Kopitiam coffee. Mine is cham. It's hard to drink this. It's so frothy, the Malaysian way of making coffee. It's so hard with a mustache. This is
Oh God.
This is cham. It's half coffee, half tea. Kopitiam staple. This is sort of the first wave of coffee shops that were for the public, right? Like, in Southeast Asia, the beginning of the coffee story starts with the colonists, right? So it took a very long time before it was accepted by, or presented to, the actual people who are from here. But it kind of started in Singapore, Malaysia with the Kopitiam culture, which is what would influence Thailand. We've done a whole lot on that on the channel before. I'll link it in the top pinned comment, but I'm like consciously slowing myself down as I talk. I have this is like, if I could start, I love living in Bangkok. I love, our life where it is right now. But Malaysian mornings, to start in a Kopitiam is, to me, like that's the best possible start to a day.
I'm just like, I'm in between my coffee kicks now.
So I find this kind of almost subversive. Like, when the whole coffee culture started in Southeast Asia, not for colonists, but for the actual people, it kind of almost started as rebellion. It's like, in Malaysia, we're at a Kopitiam right now, Malaysia and Singapore, that was one side of the story, obviously, which we've covered here on the channel before, but the domestic workers in the English households who learned the recipes, coffee, toast. This is with the kaya, which is a coconut custard that's actually first influenced by the Portuguese when they were the colonists. Like, such an interesting story, finally presented to the public. We see the same thing in Hong Kong, where the cha chanting culture, which is, it translates to tea house, but it's very coffee focused. And cha chanting culture in Hong Kong also started with, how do we take these dishes that were almost prohibited from eating, or drinks that were prohibited from having, and present them in a way that's affordable for the masses. And like, you're nodding.
Macaroni with ketchup.
Deep fried peanut butter French toast.
Yes.
And then obviously Vietnam is the classic example because of when how everything was sort of adapted for the local people in rebellion against the French banning them from having coffee. It's such an interesting sort of chapter in history, and like, don't underestimate the coffee culture in Southeast Asia. It's absolutely phenomenal, and I'm just going to keep rambling because I've had a bunch of coffee and I can't stop myself. If you've watched these videos before, you probably know what's coming next. Monoculture farming, in this case an extreme example, pretty much always ends the same way, with some awful pest or disease that rips through the global harvest. In the case of coffee, it was a fungus first identified in 1869 in Sri Lanka, and quickly devastating the entire local industry. Then from there it would spread to India, then Southeast Asia, and soon the entire Eastern Hemisphere was in trouble. Now at first there was nothing anyone could do. Plantation owners switched to growing tea, and all across Europe, tea consumption skyrocketed, coffee shops rebranding as tea houses. For the last 2 decades of the 19th century, coffee became essentially a New World drink, grown and consumed pretty much only in the West, where the blight thankfully did not take hold. But then in 1895, a French botanist realized that the people in Central Africa, what's now Gabon and the Democratic Republic of the Congo, were growing and consuming a native strain of coffee that was not the same as the one the rest of the world knew. It turned out this varietal grew in lowlands, tolerating high heat, perfect for the Asian tropics, and even better, it was almost completely resistant to the devastating coffee fungus. At first, this new strain would be given the name Coffea canephora, but in 1900 at the Paris World's Fair, it would be introduced to the world as Robusta. And the old varietal, what had been called Mocha or simply coffee, came to be known as Arabica. Now, Robusta coffee is very different from Arabica. It's more bitter, has a stronger flavor, and pretty soon, scientists realized it could hold up to freeze-drying or preserving in ways Arabica could not, and so the instant coffee revolution would kick into high gear. The idea for making a fast packet coffee started as far back as 1881, with a French soldier named Alphonse Allais, who found himself frustrated with the coffee rations on the battlefield. So he developed a method of dehydrating brewed coffee. But his invention was grainy and hard to drink, so entered David Strang of New Zealand, who came up with a water-soluble coffee powder in 1890. A few years later, this would be perfected by Satoru Kato from Japan working in Chicago, who made that powder shelf-stable and long-lasting. And finally, after the introduction of Robusta, this would be turned into a commercial product by George Washington. A different George Washington, this one born in Belgium, working in Brooklyn. Washington's coffee would be bought out by the United States Army during World War I, where it was given the slang name George, as in a cup of George. How that eventually turned into a cup of Joe has been entirely lost to history. Anyway, all these early versions of instant coffee still had to be brewed, boiled and filtered, and they weren't really instant. Until in 1938, a Swiss chemist named Max Morgenthaler pioneered a truly revolutionary version, blending coffee extract with added carbohydrates to make something fast, efficient, and packed with flavor. This would be introduced by Nestlé as Nescafé. Now, at the same time as instant coffee was coming into existence, a parallel movement was focused on increasing speed and quality at the same time. This would be centered in Italy, starting in 1884 when Angelo Moriando of Torino built the first ever steam-powered coffee machine. In 1901, this would be advanced by Luigi Pizzera of Milan, who refined the concept so it could brew single portions, one by one. Pizzera's patent would be sold to an engineer named Desiderio Pavoni, who added some upgrades and then in 1906 introduced the machine and the concept of espresso to the world. Believe it or not, it wasn't until 1947 when espresso machines would be refined enough to start adding milk or cream into the brew, opening the door to stuff like cappuccino, cafe latte, and pretty much the entire modern category of coffee. As for the Americano, by the way, that shows up around the same time in Italy, named for the American soldiers stationed after World War II who wanted their espresso watered down to taste more like the drip coffee they favored back home. Though it should be mentioned that drip coffee is not an American invention. That credit goes to a humble German housewife named Melita Benz, who in 1908 punched some holes in the bottom of a brass pot, lined it with a sheet of paper from her son's school notebook, and found the result to be very satisfying. Mrs. Benz, by the way, would patent this invention, set up a company to mass produce her creation, and to this day, Melita is one of the world's largest manufacturers of coffee-related accessories. Anyway, one last note before we move on. In case all this time you've been wondering why mocha today means coffee mixed with chocolate, that starts in the United States in the early 20th century with a craze for coffee-flavored sweets, especially cake frosting. This became known as mocha cake, and to give it a little bit more sweetness, it became common for chocolate to be added into the recipe. The combination of coffee and chocolate would catch on and soon enough was applied to a drink, and that is where the new definition of mocha came from. Let's take one last coffee break. A few last odds and ends before we move on. The coffee styles we see most often all around the world might have taken their current form after World War II, but the seeds, at least in some cases, were planted much earlier. The cappuccino first shows up, at least in name, in 18th century Austria, the combination of milk and coffee said to resemble the brown robes of Capuchin monks, hence the original term cappuccino. Contrary to popular belief, it is not Italian, and that's because around the same time in Italy, the identical recipe took on its own name, caffè latte. There are some coffee styles that don't show up until decades after the espresso revolution. The cortado, for example, comes from 1960s Spain, with workers asking for their espresso to be cut, or cortar, with a bit of milk. The long black first appears in the 1950s and the flat white in the mid-80s, both the subject of fierce argument between Australia and New Zealand, heated enough that they deserve their own video one day. It's not a style of coffee, but while we're here, let's mention decaf. That shows up in 1903 when a German coffee seller received some beans that had been submerged in seawater, surprisingly keeping their flavor but not their caffeine. And finally, the modern pour-over, well, that goes back to Melita Bentz herself. The modern hand-pour revolution taking hold in Japan in the late 1990s. So I'm going to make this very fast because I am consciously trying to not speak at 1,000 miles an hour after all the coffee, but saving the best for last. I think in Bangkok, this is Daria. If this hasn't been clear already, Daria is the coffee expert, not me. I'm the 7-Eleven coffee drinker, as unfortunately you have seen on the channel many times in the past. Daria, who has probably experimented with almost every coffee
and
shop
worked in every coffee shop as
Bangkok.
well.
This is your.
This is my favorite.
This is where you go. So what we're drinking right now, mine is the what you would call you pour over coffee. What do we call this?
Drip.
Yeah, drip coffee, pour over coffee. Not drip. This is different context. This is Ethiopian Rewrote, which comes from the highlands. I was looking it up. Many people, if you're into artisan coffee, you know Yirgacheffe, which is a really famous coffee growing area in Ethiopia. That's where this is more or less from, and Daria's is a Peruvian blend.
Did you learn it yesterday?
I learned it. I Googled it right now. I literally have Google Maps open on my phone. I was checking where, but don't give away the game. All right. I wanted to ask Daria while we're here, just thinking about this profusion of coffee, artisan coffee, where you can kind of choose your own palate or your own style. Do you have anything stand out in your memory? And I'm asking this for a reason, of like a cafe that you've been to anywhere in our travels or filming or otherwise that you're just like, man, that was a really cool place.
There are a couple of places that come up first to my mind. Do you remember Soloist in Beijing?
Oh, yeah. I think I introduced that to you, no?
What a great place. Yes, it's one of the first artisanal places in Beijing.
Right a block from Tiananmen.
There was like,
yeah.
before China coffee culture, they were like one of the first ones to
yeah.
actually do it well. And they also overlooking Tiananmen. Not overlooking Tiananmen.
But I mean, it kind of was. It was right there, like a block from Tiananmen, and it was one of those. It was the first place I ever had to wait a long time for a coffee.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And it made you angry.
At first, until I tried it, and then it was great.
This would be probably like the first that comes up to my mind. Graf from Chiang Mai.
Yeah.
Next time we're in Chiang Mai, we definitely need to go there. They're like one of the, I think, like trendsetters, like one of the best coffee places in Thailand.
Yep.
And Mother Roaster, of course, one of the first place probably for coffee that we went to, and that was like, again, when I saw her, I was starstruck. I have a picture with her still, and I'm like super happy.
I think for me, it's in Sulawesi when Dennis and I were there shooting in Makassar. We didn't get it on camera. We went there after we were filming, but that was just like the coolest. Everything local, and each coffee kind of had its own way, and again, we're not almost off camera, he's off screen, but it's interesting how different beans are better prepared in different ways. There are some things that they would tell you, okay, you need to have this made, like this, and it's just the temperature of the water. I don't know, I'm talking about something I don't really understand, but yeah, no, you choose the beans, I guess, based on how it's best prepared, right? Yeah. The best way to make it. Again.
Can I eat?
You can eat, you can drink.
This is my favorite breakfast plate, probably in the world.
Oh, this is so good. Dennis, before we stop rolling tape, I'm going to ask you the same question. Is there one cafe? No, you're more of a tea drinker. Is there one cafe that stands out to you?
Yeah.
The Kopitiam in KL? Oh, dude, how good was that? We can call that artisanal. Yeah, it's just because they make it in a tin can, it's still artisanal. Yeah. All right.
Okay. I eat.
Yeah, go ahead and eat.
I'm already like.
If you're watching this somehow from Bangkok, this is the best plate of breakfast in the city. I can definitively say that. But I'm going to enjoy my coffee, and then I'm going to crash hard and nap on the couch for the next 2 hours. Thank you so much for having us. I appreciate it. That's a cut on our final cup of coffee of the day.
Cups of coffee.
Despite what you might assume, the first coffee chains were not American. Depending on what sources you read, the idea of multi-outlet coffee shops dates back to the early 20th century in England, or France, or even Japan. And the modern, everything identical concept was actually pioneered in Austria, where by the 1920s, Ada had a half dozen locations all serving the same pastries and drinks in the same style. The first major American cafe brand was the memorably named Chock full of Nuts, as you might expect, originally a nut shop. And while chain stores in general do not have the best reputations, in this case, it was actually a pretty good company. Way before this was normal, they insisted on equal opportunity hiring and refused to expand into the South because of laws enforcing segregation. They paid a living wage and provided all staff with health care, and in 1957, hired the civil rights icon Jackie Robinson to serve as corporate vice president when his baseball playing career ended. But that's just a side note because this is obviously about Starbucks. The biggest coffee empire in world history started in 1971 in Seattle, founded by three friends and based on a small chain called Pete's, which they'd loved as students at the University of San Francisco. They would name it Starbucks, not because of Moby Dick, but because they liked the way the word sounded. Over the next 13 years, they'd grow to about 5 locations in Seattle, then sell their shares in Starbucks to outside investors. Now, this sounds like the classic tragic story of people founding a big company and selling out too early, but that's actually not what happened. This is one of the only examples I can think of where somehow everybody actually won. The first of the Starbucks co-founders, Jerry Baldwin, well, he would use his share of the money to buy out Pete's, the brand's original inspiration, and would grow that business large enough to take it public in 2001. He's now a Napa Valley winemaker and worth about $500 million. The second partner, Gordon Bowker, well, he would scale up his side project, Red Hook Brewery, which would also go public after merging with or acquiring a few other pioneering beer companies. He passed away in 2025 at the age of 82. And finally, there was Zev Siegel, who actually left Starbucks before the sale and set out on a path of serial entrepreneurship, becoming a well-known business mentor and public speaker. As for Starbucks itself, well, it would also do pretty well. Bought out by Howard Schultz, who would lead a push for fast expansion and then listed as an IPO in 1992. Today, there are more than 41,000 Starbucks stores across the world, and you don't need me to talk much about Starbucks because you know what it is. You've seen it everywhere, and it is basically the McDonald's of coffee. Or actually, McDonald's is the McDonald's of coffee because they are second in the world in sales, pouring around 3 billion cups per year in their own worldwide venues. For the record, just in case you're wondering, the rest of the top 5 are China's Luckin Coffee, Dunkin', formerly Dunkin' Donuts, and Canada's Tim Hortons. There are positives about these massive coffee conglomerates. I'm going to be honest, I love Dunkin' Coffee. But the biggest positive is probably the response, the pushback against the corporatization of the category. According to most analysis, the so-called third wave started in 1995 with Chicago's Intelligentsia Coffee and Durham, North Carolina's Counterculture Coffee. Then soon enough, they would be followed by other artisanal roasters all across the planet, focusing not on sales volume but on supply chain, flavor, technique, and quality, and bringing us into an unequivocal coffee golden age. But that golden age might not last much longer. Every year as the climate gets warmer, there is less arable land suitable for coffee farming. This is not alarmism. This is what is happening right now. In the coffee growing part of the world, lowland plantations are already dying out. And to keep up with a suitable temperature range, farms are moving as much as 500 meters higher in elevation, which means more land clearing, which reinforces the cycle. At this moment, the current prediction from trade organizations is that by 2050, global coffee production is going to be reduced by half versus where it is right now, and that is the best case scenario. The worst case is apocalyptic. Because of the effect of climate change on Central and East Africa, the vast majority of wild coffee strains are either already gone or in imminent danger of extinction. And that means if there is another blight, fungus, or disease, we are running out of options to find the next Robusta, the next bean that might save the day. This is not a political issue. This is not something up for debate because it's not theoretical. It's already happening. And all around the world, coffee producers are sounding the alarm. Now, this doesn't mean that coffee is just all of a sudden going to disappear tomorrow, but it 1000% does mean we should not take coffee for granted. This incredible plant that rewrote history, that sparked so much creativity and innovation, the center of our social and business lives, and something that just makes the world so much more interesting. From the mountains of Ethiopia to the Arabian Peninsula, the cafes of Istanbul to the coffee shops of London, from Java to Martinique, Brazil to Vietnam to wherever you are, coffee deserves its due. So next time you order an espresso martini, try a shot of Kahlua or a Tenerife Barraquito. The next time you visit a Kopitiam, a diner, or an artisan roastery. The next time you enjoy a cafe latte, a cappuccino, a mocha, or an Americano. Take just a second to appreciate coffee, because honestly, what would we do without it? Subscribe to the channel for more from OTR. Thank you so much to everybody who supports us on Patreon. It really helps to keep us going. Find links below to our Patreon and social media, and we'll see you soon. This is going to end badly for both of us. 30 years before the first cafe would open in Venice, the Dutch sent a spy into Yemen to... Fingers licking my leg now too, or was a second ago. Okay. In Austria, the Viennese introduced the idea of filtering coffee and serving it with sides like cream and sugar. This is so hard.
She's like waiting for you to start, so she...
In the year 1616, Vanga's just wagging her tail with a toy. One last try before we cut. I'm gonna just feed them. And that brings us to the next part of this story. Jesus, that was hard.